My name is Anna Christina, and until recently, I was a woman completely certain of my beliefs. I grew up in a traditional Christian family and was taught from an early age that marriage was an eternal, unbreakable alliance, something sacred in the eyes of God. I married Carlos at 25, full of dreams, believing that our love would be sustained by faith and commitment. In the first years, I was truly happy. We built a life together, shared moments of joy, and I believed that, despite the challenges, our marriage was solid. But as the years passed, something changed. Carlos began to distance himself, becoming cold and indifferent. The affectionate man who once held my hands at the altar now barely looked into my eyes. Conversations became monotonous, smiles grew rare, and I found myself living with a stranger under the same roof. Even so, I stayed. I prayed every night for God to restore our marriage, fasted, and sought advice at church. Whenever I sought support, I always heard the same words: pray more, be patient. Marriage is a divine purpose. I tried to believe that all of this was a trial, a challenge for my faith, but inside me something screamed in despair. Did God really want me to spend the rest of my life in a loveless marriage just for fear of disobeying Him? Each day became a silent struggle, a weight that crushed me. And then it happened. My body, tired from years of anguish and repression, simply gave in. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was at home, making tea, when everything went dark. A deep void swallowed me, and for the first time, I felt what it is like to be between life and death. When I opened my eyes, something was terribly wrong. I was still in the kitchen, but not in the way I should have been. My body lay there, fallen on the floor, motionless. The teapot had tipped over, and a dark liquid was spreading across the cold floor. My fingers were bent in a strange way, and my face looked pale, lifeless. Terror seized me, but before I could understand what was happening, I heard screams. My sister, who was visiting me, burst into the kitchen, ran, and knelt beside me. I saw her face contorted with despair as she shook my shoulders and cried out my name. I wanted to answer, to say that I was fine, but I couldn't make a sound. It was then that the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. I was no longer in my body. I was floating above everything, observing that scene with a strange mixture of disbelief and terror. An indescribable chill ran through my being, as if an essential part of me had been ripped away. There was a sensation of lightness, but also of complete loss of control. I tried to move, but I had no body, only a floating consciousness trapped in that space. Time seemed distorted, dragging in some moments and speeding up in others. I saw my sister pick up the phone and desperately dial for emergency services. I could hear her voice, choked, trembling, pleading for help. But as disturbing as it was to see my own inert body on the floor, the true horror was yet to come. Something began to change around me. The air seemed to grow denser, heavier. A profound silence settled, as if the world around me was being muffled. Then I felt it. An invisible force was pulling me back, as if something was dragging me away from that room, away from everything I knew. At first, I tried to resist, but it was useless. I was being sucked back, as if an invisible current was effortlessly dragging me along. The kitchen, my sister, my own body, everything began to recede rapidly until it disappeared completely. In its place, there was only a dark, infinite void. It wasn't an ordinary darkness, but something absolute, oppressive, as if I were immersed in the very absence of existence. A sepulchral silence enveloped me, but then, suddenly, that silence was broken. Voices began to whisper around me, low and halting whispers, as if a group of people were speaking at the same time, yet their words were incomprehensible. Some of those voices sounded pleading, others distant and indifferent, and some had a cold, cutting tone, almost mocking. My heart, if I still had one in that state, filled with dread. I did not know where I was, but every fiber of my being screamed that this was not a good place. Then, I felt it. Presence. Not a comforting presence, but something that watched me from the depths of the darkness. Something that knew exactly who I was. The whispering of the voices intensified, merging into a chaotic murmur that enveloped me from all sides. Suddenly, words began to stand out amid the whirlwind of sounds. You have failed. You disobeyed. You knew it was wrong. They did not come from a specific place, they seemed to emanate from within the darkness itself. My chest tightened in a way I had never felt before, as if something were draining all my strength. Guilt. An overwhelming weight of guilt descended upon me, and for a moment, all I could think was that perhaps I had indeed failed. Perhaps God was punishing me for all the doubts I had harbored within, for questioning whether He really wanted me to remain in that marriage. Was this darkness my final destiny? Despair overtook me. I tried to scream, but there was no sound. I wanted to run, to escape that suffocating darkness, but there was nowhere to go. It was as if I were trapped in a formless space, with no beginning and no end. Those voices continued, repeating words of condemnation, and I began to feel a pain unlike any other I had ever experienced. It wasn't physical pain, but a sensation of being shattered from the inside, as if every fragment of my soul were being torn apart, exposed, and judged. Everything I feared, all my doubts and anguish, seemed to come alive around me. It was as if that darkness were a reflection of all the suffering I had carried for years. Of every night I cried alone, asking God why my marriage had become a silent prison. Then, in the midst of that torment, something changed. A light appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a tiny point, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew, expanding until it broke through the darkness. Its warmth was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just light, but something alive, pulsating, imbued with a presence that I recognized instantly. God. There was no other explanation. That light was not an ordinary vision. It was something that filled every void within me, as if I were seeing beyond my earthly existence, beyond who I thought I was. The voices ceased, the oppressive weight of guilt dissolved, and, for the first time in a long while, I felt whole. I was pulled toward thy light, not with fear but with a deep desire to approach, to understand what was happening. As I approached the light, an indescribable peace took hold of me. It was as if all the pain, doubts, and anguish I had carried for so many years simply ceased to exist. The light enveloped me, but instead of blinding me, it brought absolute clarity. I was not just seeing the light, I felt it, as if I were diving into something infinitely greater than myself. Then, images began to emerge before me. They were like memories, but not just mine. I saw women like me, trapped in loveless marriages, carrying a burden that was not theirs. I saw faces marked by suffering, trembling hands clutching wedding rings as if they were chains. I saw silent tears falling on pillows, prayers uttered in despair, lost gazes searching for an answer that never came. And then, a voice. It wasn't like the cold voices from the earlier darkness. This one was different. It was strong, yet gentle at the same time. It was like an echo within my soul, filling every empty corner of my being. Love was never a prison. Those words resonated within me with a devastating impact. And, suddenly, I understood. God did not want me chained to suffering. He never asked me to annihilate myself in the name of a marriage that was already dead. The pain I had carried for so long was not a test of faith, but a human distortion of what commitment means. True love was freedom, growth, something that brings us closer to God, not something that separates us from Him. The images continued to pass before my eyes, showing me the stories of other people who, like me, had confused submission with sacrifice. Each scene that appeared before me seemed to carry a deep significance, as if God were showing me something I should have understood long ago. Primera sa W. Bunte. Women who remained in unhappy marriages until their last breath, believing they were doing the divine will when in fact, they had only allowed their souls to slowly fade away. I saw men who repeatedly betrayed their wives, but were forgiven in the name of keeping the home together, while their wives suffered in silence. I saw children growing up in homes where love did not exist, learning that marriage was synonymous with obligation and not with happiness. The truth hit me with a crushing weight. How many lives had been destroyed by a misguided interpretation of what God really wanted? And then, one last image, I saw myself sitting alone on the living room sofa, hugging a pillow, with my gaze lost in emptiness. I recognized that moment. It was a night when I cried myself to sleep, suffocated by the pain of loneliness within my own marriage. The light around me seemed to vibrate, and the voice spoke again. I never wanted this for you. My chest tightened, and a mix of relief and sadness overwhelmed me. For years, I had feared that asking for a divorce was an unforgivable sin, an act of disobedience against God. But now, in the face of truth, I understood the error. It wasn't the divorce that was distancing me from him, it was the fear, the guilt, the belief that my pain was a necessary sacrifice. The light began to intensify around me, and I realized that something was changing. I was being brought back. The moment the light started pulling me back, a whirlwind of sensations took over me. It was as if I were being sucked through an invisible corridor, while a mix of conflicting emotions surged through me. Part of me wanted to stay there, enveloped in that peace, absorbing every fragment of that divine revelation. But another part knew that there was still something that needed to be done, something that only I could decide. The light gradually dissolved, and suddenly, I felt an impact. My body. The sensation was suffocating, as if I had been plunged into something dense and heavy. The sounds around me returned all at once, agitated voices, cries, the intermittent beep of machines. My lungs burned as I tried to take my first breath. Primera awe. The brightness of the hospital blinded me for a moment, and soon I realized that my sister was by my side, holding my hand tightly. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying so much. Doctors and nurses were saying things that I couldn't fully comprehend. I only knew that, somehow, I had survived. Primera, Laider. For a long time, feeling every beat of my heart as if it were the first. But more than anything, I felt that something inside me had changed forever. I was no longer the same Anna Cristina who collapsed in that kitchen. The doubt that had tormented me for so many years had been answered. I no longer needed to fear. God did not want me trapped in a loveless marriage. Yet, as I looked up at the white ceiling of the hospital, a new question took over my mind. If God allowed me to come back, if He freed me from fear, would He also allow me to start over? The following days were a whirlwind of reflections and intense emotions. My sister stayed by my side the whole time, watching me with a look that was part worry and part relief. I knew she wanted to ask me about what had happened, about what I felt while I was out, but the words seemed to fail her. Perhaps because, deep down, she feared the answer. And I understood her. How can one explain to someone that I saw and felt the presence of God so clearly that I was rescued from the darkness by a truth that completely changed my life? I myself was still trying to understand everything that had happened, but one thing was certain. I could no longer live the same way. For the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of freedom, as if invisible chains had been broken inside me. When I returned home, the reality of my marriage hit me even harder. Carlos was there, just the same as always, distant, cold, almost indifferent to what had happened to me. He asked if I was all right, but without emotion, without genuine interest. It was as if I had returned to a world where he had never really been present, and it was at that moment that everything became clear to me. I had spent years waiting for a miracle, waiting for God to restore something that was already dead. But God did not want me to wait. He wanted me to choose. For me to understand that love is not a sentence, but a path. And, for the first time, I knew what my answer was. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and watched Carlos sleeping beside me. I no longer felt anger, sadness, or resentment, only a deep certainty that our story had come to an end. For the first time, there was no fear. I knew I would face judgment, that the church would see me as someone who gave up, that people would murmur words of reproach. But none of those voices could be stronger than the one that had echoed inside me since my experience. The voice that told me that love was never a prison, that God does not want empty sacrifices, but rather whole hearts. And my heart was no longer there. The next morning, I sat down with Carlos and calmly said the only thing that needed to be said. I'm leaving. He did not argue, did not ask why. Perhaps, deep down, he knew that this moment would come. The truth is, over the years, we had not only grown apart, we had been disappearing. I left without looking back, taking nothing but the certainty that I was doing the right thing. But as I walked out of that house that I once called home, one last question stayed with me. If God gave me the chance to start over, would He also allow me to love again?